Picture it. A young, bright-eyed Apostle Paul wanders around Athens, taking in all the sights. This is not his country. These are not his people. He is a fish out of water. But as he strolls around, he sees the statues, the altars, the shrines, all dedicated to the ancient Greek goddesses and gods. There's the Parthenon with its marble colonnade. There's the ivory statue of Athena with her golden spear shining in the sun. And somewhere along the way, he stumbles upon an altar inscribed with 4 curious words, "To an unknown God." Apparently, despite all the gods that the Greeks knew, and they knew a lot of them, they had a whole pantheon, from Zeus to Hera to Hades. They still made sure to have at least one altar to whatever deity they might have forgotten. It was like a catch-all, an insurance policy, an altar to CYA. Just in case there was a god that they had missed, they did not want him or her to be angry with them. Because you see, to the Greeks, the gods were capricious. You had to keep them happy, or they just might come down and punish you. Hence, this strange altar that Paul found, a generic catch-all shrine dedicated to an unknown God. So, if you were Paul, you would have had 3 options. 1, you just get out of there, leave them far behind. Or 2, you stand up and say, "What is wrong with you people? You actually believe this garbage?" Or 3, you do what he did. You see, Paul stood before the citizens of Athens and said, "You know, I've been walking around your town today, and I can tell you are a religious people. You and I have that in common. I even saw that you have an altar inscribed to an unnamed God. Well, guess what? Where I'm from, we've come to know that unnamed God because he has come near us and walked among us, and I'd like to tell you about him." See, Paul could have said, "You idiots, you've got this all wrong." But instead, he was gracious. He quoted their own poets to them. He talked about what they had in common. He met them where they were. You see, Paul knew what our mamas have long tried to tell us. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. That shouldn't be surprising, because that's exactly what God did for Paul. And by the way, it's what God does for you and me too. Back when Paul was spending all his days persecuting the Christians of the early church, God came along, knocked him off his horse, and said, "I'm going to need you to use that energy in a different way." See, God could have acted like the capricious gods of Greece. God could have just wiped Paul out. But instead, God met him where he was, loved him where he was, and started the long, slow conversion of Paul's heart from that beginning point. So maybe it's no surprise to us that that's what Paul does too. Everywhere he goes, every town he enters, every church that Paul starts, he looks for what people have in common first. He builds relationships. He meets people where they are, because this is what God once did for him. That's good news for you in at least 2 ways today. Number 1, God has also met you wherever you were, just like he did Paul. Paul was a scallywag, but God met him where he was and turned his gifts toward him. God has done the same for you, and don't you ever forget that. But number 2, and maybe more importantly, God continues to meet you where you are. At a time like this, that is good to know, especially while you and I still cannot gather at our altar to our God to worship in all our old reliable ways. We crave the Eucharist. We crave our fellowship. We crave our God. Like Paul said to those in Athens, it can feel like we're groping in the dark for God right now. But the truth is, God is already and always has been very nearby. Even right now, as you and I desperately wish we could just get back to normal, it's important to remember that God still meets you right where you are. This is why I harp on gratitude all the time. Look around you. What do you see? Where do you see the concrete evidence of God in your life today? And I don't just mean in the abstract like some nameless altar to an unknown God. I mean in the actual. Where have you seen signs of God's grace today? I bet if you look, you can find them. And if you can see signs of God's grace in your life, then you can know and believe that God is meeting you where you are. Imperfect as this situation is, and imperfect as you may be. And if that's true, well then maybe that means that you can afford to do the same for others. What might that look like? Well, say your friend posts something idiotic on social media. I know, what are the chances, right? Just like Paul, just like God, you have choices. You could just press the snooze button or delete them and walk away. Or you could fire up the comments and say, "You idiot, what is wrong with you?" Or maybe, just maybe, you could seek to find a way to meet them where they are. Not to give in, not to compromise your morals, but maybe simply to have the grace to say, could we talk a little more about this offline? Because I see this pretty differently, but I know I like you. I've always liked you, and I've always had lots in common with you. I know that sounds like pie in the sky and like a waste of time. It requires relationship. It would take a risk. It would take time, much more time than the 10 seconds it would take you to fire off an angry comment, or better yet, just to delete them from your feed. But at the risk of sounding really cliched, y'all, God has not deleted you from His feed. Every time you've ever gone off the rails, every time you've given into fear, shown your worst side, said things that were not true, God has not cast you off. In fact, God has pulled you closer. God has met you where you are, even if it's not exactly where He hopes you'll stay. So, as we battle these days, not just for the physical health of our global society, but also for its very soul, will you get to decide? In this age of lies and disinformation, of anger and mistrust, as people worship what they do not know because they are afraid, who will you be? Seems to me a little humility and grace could go a long way these days. And like the Apostle Paul, we might just find that relationship leads to repentance, and conversation leads to conversion, far more effectively than just trying to prove our own rightness and righteousness. Because you know what? Truth is, God meets you where you are. And like Mama always said, you're going to catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Amen.